There was a time when the Fourth Estate was considered an essential partner in a fully functioning democracy, another check on the power of those in government and beyond. But the mere fact that the phrase MSM, mainstream media, or as some call them, the lamestream media, well, that's become a slur in some circles, and it's clear many see that traditional media role as part of long-ago history. Joining us now for a hard look at the state of trust in media, we welcome, in Berlin, Germany, via Skype, Jay Rosen, media critic and professor of journalism at NYU, New York University. And here in our studio, Sue-Ann Kelman, professor emeritus at the Ryerson School of Journalism. Jan Wong, longtime journalist at the Globe and Mail, now an associate professor of journalism and communications at St. Thomas University in Fredericton, New Brunswick. Andre Demise, columnist at Maclean's Magazine. And Jonathan Kay, senior editor at the online platform Quillette.com. You are the Canadian editor, period?
That's right.
That's what we call you.
We're recruiting more, but right now I'm it.
You are it. Well, they're in good shape. Okay. Good to welcome all of you here at TVO and in Berlin, Germany. Jay, thanks for taking some time for us. I want to set this up by reading the following. According to, you know, this Edelman Trust is this institution that does this barometer of, you know, government, business, NGOs, media. What's the most trusted institution in the world? Of the 28 countries, the average percentage of the populations who do not trust in media, 57%. The numbers are as such. France, it's 67%. In Russia, 65%. In the U.S., 58%. We're doing a little better in Canada at 51%. I should remind those of you who followed the Ontario election campaign that Doug Ford, the PC party leader, now Premier designate, sent this message to PC party supporters during the campaign. He said, "The pollsters and the media are ganging up on us to try to keep us down. They are scared of what happens when the people get a voice." Here we go. Media versus the people, John. Trumpism 101. Is that coming to the province of Ontario?
Probably. You know, whatever you think of Doug Ford, I think it's fair to say that the Toronto Star especially was gunning for him the entire time. They treated his political rise as a disaster. Sometimes news and commentary were intermingled. And, you know, supporters of Doug Ford, people who are opponents of Doug Ford, I think they would agree that if you read the Toronto Star and some other major media, they had a campaign against him. That campaign failed, but you can see why Doug Ford was angry about it.
Having said that, Sue-Ann, if you read the Toronto Sun or if you read the National Post, you'd think that the media aren't so bad after all as it relates to Doug Ford, right?
Yes, you would. But he'd noticed that he didn't trust even them, that he didn't have media on the bus for the campaign, and what he did have was an aide, Lindsay Vanstone,
yeah.
Yes, acting as a reporter for his news feed, interviewing him and making it look like a news channel. I think that a lot of politicians have learned this lesson, that, in fact, it starts with Reagan, who realized that photo ops are far easier to control than press conferences. No one asks you a hard question. The worst that can happen is that a rabbit will bite you on the White House lawn, which once happened. They've learned that if they control their social media feeds, they don't need mainstream media as much, and they can keep the message control because no one's going to ask an awkward and embarrassing question like, where will the money come from?
Jay Rosen, let me ask you this, given your year and a half's worth of experience beyond what we have here, dealing with Donald Trump and somebody who's clearly very hostile to the media. What's your advice to the mainstream media about how to handle a political leader who demonstrates suspicion towards the mainstream media?
Well, I think people in Canada and Ontario should get ready for a strategy in which Doug Ford makes a lot of news by being outrageous and saying all sorts of things that are norm busting and boundary busting, and therefore dominating the news agenda through a kind of lurid sensationalism, while at the same time attacking the press so that any critical information that comes out is, for his supporters at least, immediately discarded. That's the pattern we've seen with Donald Trump, and I strongly expect you'll see it in Ontario.
In fairness to the Ford campaign, Andre, we should say that press release that I read earlier, that e-blast that went out to Tory supporters saying the media are out to get us, that was the kind of the one moment it happened during the campaign in that way. It hasn't been Trumpian in as much as it hasn't been coming every other minute on Twitter, et cetera, et cetera.
But the timing was pretty fortuitous. It came after there was multiple scandals emerging from the PC campaign. So there was the possibility of data theft from 407's databases. There was candidates who were under investigation, and then there was the recording of Doug Ford possibly selling memberships for one of his local candidates. So as soon as that spate of news came out, that's when
against the rules.
Exactly, and it wasn't even just the membership against the rules, but him attending a fundraiser for another local candidate, which was also supposed to be against the rules.
That's against the law. Never mind the rules.
Yeah, and so what we were seeing happening was just a slew of negative press, and it wasn't as though the press was attacking Doug Ford or attacking the PCs. They were simply reporting the facts as they were, and that's when you saw that e-blast come out. So even though it wasn't happening over the course of the campaign, it was still rather convenient that that's when he chose to take a stand on the mainstream media.
Jan, I want to get your take on something that, from a Westerner's eyes, I think sounds kind of curious. In that list of countries that we showed earlier, one country we did not put on the list is a country where they have 71% trust and faith in the media, and that country is a country you've written books about, China. And they have a very controlled media.
That's right. So that's why this poll is worthless, right? I would say it's worthless. And I think the question of, should the media be nice to the candidate is ridiculous. It's not the question that the media needs to ask. We need to report the news. And if the voters still vote the way they do, that's another democracy problem. But our role is not to try to counteract being called names by a candidate who hires a fake reporter who won't let journalists onto the bus. But by the way, I hate being on those buses, so that's fine with me.
There was no bus this time anyway.
Yeah, exactly. But so our question isn't, how do we placate them? How do we counter this? We just do our jobs. And if voters don't buy it, we can't help that.
Jay, that seems to have been lost, though, in some of, I know when we look south across the border, it certainly feels like much of the media you watch in the United States right now is not just doing their job. They've taken a side in this fight. Are we supposed to do that?
Well, I don't think it makes sense for journalists to position themselves as the political opponents to Donald Trump or to Ford. However, there's a complication, which is the political style by which Donald Trump is dominating the scene includes a dispensing with a common world of fact. It includes attacks on democratic institutions. It includes a strategy in which the point is to divide and polarize people. And in the sense that that political style is a kind of erosion of democracy, I think journalists have to set themselves against that. So the way I've said it is, it doesn't make sense for the journalists to be the political opponents to President Trump, but they have to oppose a political style in which power gets to write its own story. And that is the danger that we're seeing now in the United States. And I think it's going to happen in Ontario with Doug Ford. I really believe that. Do
you believe that, Sue-Ann?
Yes, I do. And I think it's more widespread even than those two particular examples, that we have an enormously polarized world, and a lot of people are getting their news not from the mainstream media, not from what we're talking about here, but from social media where there is no fact-checking, where Roseanne Barr can believe a story about George Soros that has been disproved I don't know how many times. One of the difficulties here that started long before this is that news is part of a consumerist culture, that people see it as entertainment. So they want news that keeps them constantly stimulated. A frightening proportion of the population likes being angry all the time and likes news like Fox News, or if you're on the left, news about Donald Trump and Doug Ford that keeps you angry all the time. That gets in the way of examining facts and what's actually happening. In fact, it seems to me that this trend started in the late 80s and we didn't notice it so much when newspapers decided that their readers were getting the news from television, so they weren't going to do so much news. They were going to do opinion. Now, I don't know where anyone's getting news. There's so much opinion. Now that TV has also crossed that line, which it used to try to avoid, though of course the opinion's always there. News outlets are started in the first place by rich people with political agendas. And even if you have a rich person who doesn't believe he has a political agenda, or a company that is running a media conglomerate, rich people do tend at least to favor policies that help them to enhance and protect their wealth. And that's been there all the time.
It does feel, though, John, like we're in a time where if I like what you're saying, you're trustworthy and I believe you. Exactly. And if I don't like what you're saying, you're obviously fake news and you deserve to be out of business.
That's why I agree with Jan that it's hard to take these survey results seriously, because if you look at the quantity of media that people consume, and I include social media, the proof is in people's actions. Look around this building, people are staring at their phones. They're consuming media all the time. Often they're on Facebook.
I am too.
And we trust it.
I spend all this time on Twitter. Like, what's wrong with me?
Although I'd say there's a difference. Facebook in particular, we trust because it's our friends. Twitter less so because it's sort of a free-for-all. But Facebook in particular, if you count that as media, and there's no reason not to, people trust it entirely. And ironically, the problem we're describing of fake news is caused because of too much trust. Because people trust that they see something on Facebook, they say, well, my brother-in-law says that, Obama's a Muslim, so he's never lied to me. And then that becomes fake news. But that's not a sign of distrust. It's a sign of trust because you think your peers are telling you the truth.
I'm an opinion journalist, so what do I know? I don't know if I can really take part in this conversation, but I agree with what Jonathan's saying in the sense that when it comes from sources on Facebook, you will implicitly trust it, but the problem is it's completely unregulated. I think that Facebook just hasn't had the responsibility of being recognized as a media entity. We look at this past election where a great portion of the news that was being driven and the opinions that were coming out were coming from a single Facebook group. Ontario Proud. And when I checked out what was being said in those groups, they were saying incredibly inflammatory and ridiculous things like Andrea Horwath wants to open the doors to all the immigrants and we're going to be giving all of our money away. It was such a distortion. It was like a carnival funhouse mirror of what was actually happening on the ground that I couldn't even recognize it myself. But this is what people consume and what they believe.
I want to go back to Jay in Berlin, and we should tell everybody that you're over there. Obviously, you're from New York. Most of the time we get you're from New York, but you're over in Germany right now studying the German media. And according to that Edelman poll, which has been widely discredited on this program by some of the guests, but for argument's sake, let's keep going here. Apparently, the mistrust of the media in Germany is even worse than it is here in Canada. 51% of Canadians didn't trust the media, but 58% of Germans didn't trust the media. There was another survey, apparently, that found a 31-point gap between populists and non-populists in terms of mistrust. Can a mistrust of media generally be attributed to the populist upheaval around the Western world, in your view?
I think several things are going on there. First, this term, the media, has emerged as a kind of perfect hate object in the countries where it is ritually assaulted by politicians. And often, if you ask people not about the media, but about actual news sources that they regularly use, their responses are somewhat different. So that's one thing that's happening. A second thing that's happening is that all institutions, big institutions with cultural authority, are less trusted now than they used to be. And the news industry is part of that. A third thing is that the global economy just isn't working out for a lot of people. And there's an element of mistrust that simply comes from poor performance of the systems that dominate our lives. And then finally, more specific to journalism, I think, I know this is true in the United States and Australia, it's probably true in Germany, I'm still learning, but at a certain point, political journalists especially began to look at the electorate, look at the public through the eyes of the insiders and the professionals who were paid to win elections and manipulate that public. And that whole turn towards a kind of insider, poll-driven, strategy and tactics way of looking at politics was good for journalists in that it made them insiders themselves, but it turned everyone else out there, all the voters and regular people, into objects of political technique. And I think part of what's happening is people are reacting against that.
That sounds, Jen, like a perfect storm for everything that ails us today.
And I don't know what the answer is.
Yeah.
I mean, I suppose we should come up with some answers, but as journalists, we just try to do our jobs, which is try to find out the stories, try to check things. One thing I can say that I think journalists need to do more of is when something happens like a tweet, don't just report the tweet. Immediately, right beside the tweet, say whether it's true or not, give us the facts. That is where I think we're reacting too fast.
But
we
Jen,
have to say right away.
But there's
right?
a problem with that, and I think it's one of the things that erodes trust in the more thoughtful part of the population, which is that we're on a 24-hour news cycle. And when you say check it immediately, that reporter may be working on 3 other stories. I think that a lot of journalists and the people who run them, the administrators, are stretched much too thin. The 24-hour news cycle has been a disaster, I think, for the quality of journalism.
And no one has a solution to how do we pay for journalism.
No, exactly.
Nobody has
Facebook
it.
is running the stories, and and no one's getting paid for
It is a
them.
big problem. I don't know what's going to happen because I believe you really need journalism for democracy. You cannot have a democracy without a decent, strong media.
My one modest proposal would be stop with the polls already. They are
I agree.
inaccurate.
I
they
agree
are
with
part
you.
of the major turnoff. It's not just that I'm turned off by reading them because I don't trust them. If I get one more phone call from a research company because I'm old and I still have a landline and there are fewer and fewer of us.
Let's move on to this. One of the big debates around the New York Times is that its op-ed pages are biased. That's what the allegation are, that they are littered with anti-Trump conservatives and that you don't get the other side of the story. Jay, let me start with you again on this one. Do you agree that the mainstream tent at the New York Times is not wide enough?
Well, I think it's true that the New York Times reflects the place where it is made, and it reflects the views of the people who live in New York. And I can tell you that there's not a lot of sentiment for Donald Trump in New York as a New Yorker for 36 years. And why would you expect the New York Times to do anything else but reflect the place and where it is made and the people who make it? I don't get that. And the idea of a biased opinion page sounds like a contradiction in terms to me.
No, of course you want the opinion page to have opinions on it, but I, those who say, aha, you lamestream media, you only put the Trump haters on the op-ed page of the New York Times. You don't give, never mind equal time, you don't give 1/10 of the time to somebody who might have a different view. I mean, is that a legitimate argument?
No. And I'll
Still
tell
no.
you why.
Okay.
No, because what that voice that you're paraphrasing is the victimology that Donald Trump has spread from himself to his supporters, where the way that they deal with the world is either through authoritarian measures on the one hand, or by wailing about their victimhood on the other. And he's taught his supporters to do that. Now, people who support Donald Trump because they believe in the values that he brings to the political arena, of course they should have a voice. People who support Donald Trump because they have taken on some of the false claims and made up facts that he has do not deserve a voice on the op-ed page of the New York Times. And frequently when people are wailing about this, that's what they want. They want to see the conspiracy theories. They want to see the made up stories about immigrants. They want to see these fictions that Donald Trump has spread throughout the political system spread further. And no, there's no legitimate claim there.
I wonder, John, if we have the opposite problem, for example, at the Toronto Sun, where you would have been hard-pressed to find a negative column about the PC party during the course of this election campaign, or a nice thing about the Liberals and New Democrats.
Well, the problem with the Toronto Sun that I had during the recent campaign was that it sort of diluted the idea of what a scandal was. So, on the front page, they might have a so-called scandal because some NDP candidate had some controversial Facebook post up 5 years ago, or how much Andrea Horwath spent on clothes or something like that. So what happens, people had scandal fatigue. So when there really was a big scandal or medium-sized scandal about spending or voter lists or something like that, by that time people say, oh, there's scandals all around. If I may, I'd just like to address something that Jay said. I actually disagree with his caricature of the way conservatives respond to the New York Times. I have been a subscriber to the New York Times print edition for 22 years. And I also have my problems with the New York Times. I love the investigative reporting. I think it's the best newspaper in the world. However, even if you don't believe conspiracy theories, even if you aren't a Breitbart.com visitor, even if you don't spend your time screaming at your computer because of something that Rachel Maddow said, I think there is a critique of the New York Times that there's a sort of worldview on its pages that sometimes the most pressing problems in America are transgender bathrooms and course syllabi at Ivy League schools. And I think a moderate conservative would say, this is a distortion of what America is. There's little focus on the problems that ordinary Americans face. And when we read it, we are reading a reflection of how out of touch elites on the Upper West Side are.
I want to add
Jan, go.
We all want to jump in.
Everybody wants that. Hang on.
First
Okay,
of all-
Jan and Andre.
First of all, I think we're conflating two things. One is news reporting, one is opinion. I love the New York Times.
Story selection
Of
goes
course,
into that, yeah.
of course. But opinion is really different. The opinion pages are really different. Like, I worked at the Wall Street Journal for a long time. I never read the opinion page, but we really cared about our reporting. And the same thing with the New York Times. I only read the opinions I want to read that I like in the New York Times. So I go through it, but otherwise I'm not going to read it. And I know that's opinion. So I don't see a problem with having an opinion page is heavily slanted. I have a problem when the news is slanted. And I think that's where we have to fight, to the last man standing. But the opinion pages
If I could just very briefly address that, though, even in picking which news stories you're going to pick, I remember the controversy over the Augusta Golf Club, completely legitimate issue, but the New York Times ran dozens and dozens of news stories about it, and people objected that the editorial bias was embedded in the selection of stories. So
I'm
it's
fine
not,
with that bias.
You're fine with the bias,
Yeah.
but you can see how someone who's
Yeah, I
conservative
see
might
it.
have a problem, and it's not just on the opinion
I
pages.
see it,
Okay.
but
Andre.
At the same time, you might say that it deflects to a certain worldview, but they've also run multiple profiles of quote-unquote Trump country that I think are at this point completely unnecessary. And this is not just the New York Times. Just about every coastal publication has made it their mission to go into the quote-unquote heart of America and determine the heart of the Trump voter. I think at this point we know who exactly they are. As far as the opinion pages, I don't know that I've seen anything definitively anti-Trump insofar as Trump does an innocuous thing and the opinion editors rail against it. It's simply he does an outrageous thing and people respond accordingly. So this idea that, when someone says something that is patently untrue, when somebody says that Mexicans are rapists, or somebody says that we need to shut Muslims out of the country, somebody says that, our prime minister was meek in person and then went and stabbed him in the back. Those are things that you have to simply have an opinion about and be very forthright with it. Otherwise, what are we even doing?
No argument for me. I agree with that last part.
Well, I can't believe it, but I agree with Jonathan to the extent that
Hang on, let me note the date and time. Here. Hang on. All right.
I think that the media mainstream media, places like the New York Times, the Globe and Mail, the Toronto Star, have ignored large segments of the population for many years. Yes, now they are going out and exploring Trump company, but that's to make up for all the years that they were covering life in New York and not coal miners in Virginia, not struggling farmers. And the Canadian media are just as guilty. We're very urban, by and large, educated, we are an elite, and there is a tone that I can see would be extremely off-putting if you weren't part of that. Also, you just haven't seen yourself reflected. I'm with Jan. I don't care much what's on the opinion page. I expect it to reflect a bias in the Sun newspapers and in the Toronto Star. But the coverage, you should be representing everyone in your area and whatever you see your mandate is, and we have not been doing it. I want to throw in one tiny thing. I don't read women's fashion magazines much. I get to see them maybe once a year when I'm waiting to get a haircut. What I've noticed over the years is these magazines, which are aimed at young working women, they're not aimed at the rich, have crept up and crept up and crept up, not in the ads, but in the articles. The prices that are acceptable for a handbag, for a shoe, or whatever. I think if I were young and struggling and trying to be fashionable, which I've never cared about, I would be very resentful. Because
that doesn't represent you.
Yes, everything is geared towards a particular kind of urban person. There is in so much of the media assumption that everyone has money. of course you would become extremely angry over the years.
I don't know about all that, because to a point that Jonathan made a second ago, where it seemed like the New York Times, the most important issue for them was transgender bathrooms. Well, yeah, transgender people exist across the geographical spectrum. They're everywhere. There are black people, there are brown people, pretty much everywhere. If we want to talk about what quote unquote urban publications focus on, then why is it that underrepresented groups, of which I belong to at least a couple, haven't seen ourselves represented, and yet you don't see that tremendous backlash? We at least trust that what we're being told is true. We may not agree with the way that it is being told, but for some reason, marginalized and underrepresented groups are simply expected to accept what the media says, and we're fine with that. But everybody else seems to have a problem with the way that their own group is represented.
Andre, you and I may agree on more than you think, because I agree that some of the patterns you see playing out in the liberal media, I'll use that term, actually hurt underrepresented groups the most. And we saw this in Ontario with Doug Ford's election. I think because of the bias you saw, there were a lot of lily-white, middle-aged Toronto Star editors who were just shocked how many visible minorities like Doug Ford, because they'd been living in their little liberal echo chamber thinking, well, to Doug Ford, I assume he's just some kind of Donald Trump racist. I'm just going to assume that the ethnic areas in 905, they're probably not going to like him. And then they were just completely shocked. You had lifetime editors and reporters who were just absolutely bamboozled by why anybody who didn't have white skin would vote for Ford.
It's the biggest difference between Trump and Ford.
It's the biggest difference. Yeah. And by the way, I wrote an article for Foreign Policy magazine and said, hey, we want you to do an article about Doug Ford, Canada's Trump. And then I went out and investigated, and the guy actually, he didn't say anything that was even remotely close to the blatantly Islamophobic, blatantly racist stuff that Trump said. And yet, in the newsroom, CBC, Toronto Star, it's just taken for granted that Ford is the Canadian version of Trump. It's completely ridiculous.
Jay, I hear you're trying to get in.
That was a good point about Doug Ford. But going back a couple of cycles, I have no trouble acknowledging that the New York Times is a liberal newspaper. What would you expect, as I said earlier, of something that's made in New York for and by New Yorkers? But I think the reason that conservatives are so obsessed with the New York Times, and they are obsessed with it, is that they can't create something like that themselves. The New York Times is not only a cultural powerhouse, it is a marketplace success. And if conservatives don't like the fact that, yes, this is a liberal newspaper, yes, it has participated in the struggle of underrepresented groups to make themselves more visible in the culture, I think that is true. The New York Times has been part of that movement. If conservatives don't like that, then go buy the Charleston, West Virginia.
Hey, Jay, that's
pour $1 billion into it.
You know what?
And make national newspaper that millions of people would read.
Hang on, they've already done that. It's called Sinclair Media.
Yes. Also, by the way, if I could switch on, I'd say
Sinclair Media does not declare itself conservative, because Sinclair Media hides its conservatism by attaching itself to the logos of NBC, CBS, and ABC. Sinclair Media is unwilling to be that conservative alternative.
And
so get your own media.
You're right. I think he's right. It is the marketplace. It's capitalism. And people want to spend all that money on the New York Times. I have 3 subscriptions in my family because you can't share e-subscriptions. It's like, I don't know how much I'm spending, but it's worth it. I want that news. I don't want the other news. So,
Because he is right. If you don't like it, read something else.
Okay, well, actually, I do, and sometimes, and I got to say, Jay had a lot of good applause lines in there, but there is something that appeals to conservatives that's on the same quality as New York Times. It's called National Public Radio. And National Public Radio, same editorial quality as the New York Times, much more balanced. And you know why it's more balanced? Because they have to go out into the community to get donations.
They are
so
out there.
when you go to local stations, again, the quality is outstanding. I listen to it every day.
I listen to it too, and I don't see why you think it's more balanced than the New York Times.
Because they will go out, because they have affiliate stations, and their affiliate stations will
I don't find it more
provide
balanced. I find it equally great.
Well,
liberal.
okay, maybe I just shift.
Equally liberal,
Maybe
thank you.
shift local stations. I listen to NPR One, the app, fantastic app you should get for your smartphone.
I don't know what I
balanced.
listen to. It's NPR. I don't know what it is.
All right. Anyway, but I just find it's the same quality, and yet they manage to do it. The New York Times doesn't, because they don't have the same local vested interests that NPR does because of their network of
But
stations.
NPR is struggling for money all the time, and
We
that
should
is
turn
a
this into a
difference.
fundraiser right here.
No, we're not going to do
No,
that.
no.
What
At
we are-
TVO, I don't think so.
What we are going to do,
NPR is the relentless object of attack by conservatives in the United States.
Yes.
I'm here to tell you it's better. I think it's better than New York Times
Okay.
in terms of its political objectivity.
I think it's equally great.
we just got a great cutaway of Jay looking up to the heavens, thinking that John Kay is nuts, which,
Okay.
maybe an empirically
We're gonna-
provable fact, who knows? But Jay, let me read your words back to you. This was in the New York Review of Books not too long ago. There is an obvious risk, you wrote, that the press will lose touch with the country, fall out of contact with American culture. Newsroom diversity is supposed to prevent that, but the diversity project has itself been undermined by a longer and deeper project in mainstream journalism, which I have called The View from Nowhere, by which I mean the attempt to acquire authority by constructing an artificial impartiality by performing objectivity. Fill in some of the gaps there. What is this view from nowhere that you refer to there?
Here's what I mean. American journalists attempt to persuade you to trust them by saying, look, we don't have an ideology, we don't have a philosophy, we don't have a stake in this subject, we don't have an interest here. You should believe us because we are simply presenting you with the facts. And that's what I call the view from nowhere. And increasingly, that kind of claim, we don't have a point of view, we're just giving you the facts, so believe it because it's the truth. Increasingly, that claim is mistrusted. And if people mistrust that claim, they're not going to change their minds if you insist, no, really, we're actually just objective observers here. And so that project of persuading people that there are no real assumptions here, there are no starting points, there's no view of the world, there's just facts and news, so trust it, I think has a limited lifespan. And a better way to generate trust would be to start like this. Look, here's where we're coming from. Here's where we're coming from. And we have done our reporting. We have found out a lot of things. And here's what we know. Here's where we're coming from, and here's what we know. And I think the combination of those things will in the end be easier to trust.
Andre, just a couple of minutes to go here, but do you think Canadian media, those who should or those who can, ought to just do what Jay just said and say, look,
everything Jay just said is absolutely true, and I've been saying the same thing myself, is that the media performs a certain degree of objectivity when they say, for example, okay, I'll take this back to the 1990s. Do we remember how mainstream media was reporting on the quote-unquote crack baby epidemic? That is, people who were drug addicted when we're having children, they were predicting that was going to be the most violent generation of Americans that America had ever seen. And that was primarily directed towards young Black Americans. And who are they now? Well, they're the most well-educated. They're the most politically and community active people that I think the country has seen for a very long time. I'm part of that generation they might have called the quote-unquote crack baby epidemic, and my younger siblings as well. But the way that it was reported was just, well, this is simply what it is. These children don't like to be held. Now, you carry that over the course of decades where the media has consistently been reporting on certain communities in a way that has been incredibly slanted, but coming from a place of knowledge. We talk about, for example, the idea that races, some races are, they have higher IQs than others. And I see this consistently coming back and creeping into the edges of media. And we always want to have a conversation about it and say, well, why can't we have that discussion in mainstream media? Well, because it has negative lasting effects and it turns people off. It turns people like me off. So yeah, I think people are right to distrust the media when they claim objectivity, but bring in an incredibly dangerous slant.
Unfortunately, that's our time, but I am reminded of Jean Chrétien's line in which he says, we got a lot of work to do. And that is absolutely right for all of us who work in this profession. Jay Rosen from NYU, we thank you for being there on Skype for us from Berlin, Germany. And to everybody around our table here at TVO tonight, my thanks as well.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. helping businesses stay on the right side of change with strategic thinking, insightful decisions, and business leadership. Are you on the right side of change? Ask an Ontario CPA.